Hi, and welcome to episode 1 of Research in eSport, where I discuss current news or research in the field of esports. My name is Weldon from Mind Games Consulting. Today I wanted to talk about an article written by Kjell Jonasson and Jesper Thiborg called Electronic Sport and Its Impact on Future Sport. It was published in a journal a few months ago called Sport in Society. They are students at Malmö University in Sweden at the Department of Sports Studies, and I believe it's from an anthropological angle. The aim of their article was to discuss and analyze the sporting qualities of competitive computer gaming in relation to the definition of sport. So to start with, they took Alan Gutman's analysis of modern sport in 1978 and pulled out the definition from that to apply to eSport. The definition is here. This is a chart from their article, which had a typo in it. Sports should be on the right-hand side. But the breakdown is quite simple. Play consists of two things, spontaneous and organized. And organized play consists of non-competitive and competitive games. And then competitive games consist of intellectual contests and physical contests. So sports fall on the far right side of all three of those divisions. And where eSport falls is a matter of contention. It's clearly an organized game and a competitive game, but whether or not it's an intellectual contest or physical contest, it falls somewhere along that spectrum. And previously, sports have been known to move back and forth along that spectrum. For example, shooting and pool are kind of recognized, shooting more now as a sport and pool kind of as a game or a sport. It's not really clear. Some sports are obviously more physical than others, such as soccer. But then you have sports like golf, which didn't used to be considered a sport. People would laugh at you if you claimed that you were an athlete and played golf, but now nobody thinks that Tiger Woods is not an athlete. So given that we can't really define whether or not esport is a sport from the definition alone, the authors looked at Alan Gutman's characteristics of modern sport. And they were secularism, which means that he said that sports didn't have anything to do with pursuit of the sacred. So modern sport was separate from any sort of religious institution. Equality, modern sport is equal, and esport actually has a little bit more in its favor in terms of this because modern sport is segregated by gender. And esports right now, while it's still separated by dysfunction depending on what your disability is, the genders can compete equally, unlike in most physical modern sports. Specialization refers to the idea that you're a soccer player or a hockey player. You don't typically do both. In the beginning of esports, there were some FPS athletes who competed in many championships, but now it's becoming a lot more specialized, where you kind of an athlete will choose a game and focus exclusively on that. Bureaucratization refers to the buildup of institutions around sport that kind of regulate it. So a lot of governments regulate sport through ministries or departments, and then there's usually national and international organizations, and those are forming in esport, although they aren't as calcified as they are in most traditional sports. Rationalization follows bureaucratization, as it means that depending on the rules, the sport gets refined as stopwatches get better, or we use electronic timers in swimming now, for example, instead of stopwatches. Things like that. So improvement in training techniques and depending on the rules changes in sport. This kind of doesn't apply to esport because the rules are embedded in the play. They exist as part of the field. And so rationalization kind of refers to the selection of which games are then played and recognized as sport, because right now we have different games being played depending on the year, and they kind of, it's not set that we have set games in sport or in esport. So we can kind of already see this process beginning, where StarCraft was followed up by a publisher making StarCraft 2, and Halo has now become Halo Reach, the third edition of tournament play in that field. And so it's kind of like the refinement of the game as technology improves, and they re-release it with similar rules based on the first system. But then again, we also have examples of Quake, which is kind of dying away, and Counter-Strike, which is slowly being replaced by Call of Duty and games like that, which incur team play but are a lot more advanced or completely different in some ways. And then quantification refers to ranking and record keeping, which is fairly easy to do in esport, and we can see a lot of currently. So looking at the characteristics, esport fulfills quite a lot of it, with a notable absence as far as bureaucracy is concerned. So in the second half of the paper, they discuss the future of esport and start with a quote by Kutte Jensen, who says, presents a solution to that problem by asserting that sport is what sport world, athletes, sports journalists, sports spectators, etc., consider as sport. So now they're going to talk about basically three options that they see for the future of sport that will be determined by where the money is spent and what the athletes and spectators determine to be sport for them. So starting with a counterculture or alternative to modern sport, this is the fate that we have with skateboarding and surfboarding right now. Whereas snowboarding got kind of integrated into the Olympics as a winter sport, skateboarding kind of created a counterculture where they have their X Games and they have competitions and kind of regulations, but they're outside of the traditional or hegemonic sport that is recognized by society. So there's three discussion points that go along with it. The first is, what will esport gain by the efforts of being accepted as a sport? In other words, do we have anything to gain by becoming a traditional sport? Or do we not need all of the nonsense that kind of goes along with that? Some of the things that would have to come around for us to be accepted into the Olympics would be things like mandatory drug testing for athletes, and international and national organizations that govern the rules relating to sport, which right now are kind of taken over by private companies that either institute tournaments or publish games. The second discussion point is, if status is attained as a countercultural sport, does incitement to become a sport disappear? So if esports becomes so big in its own right that spectators and fans and athletes are quite happy pursuing their esport life within the esports as it is it necessary for it to become an Olympic sport? Is that desire still out there, or are we fine with just being able to make a living at it and to compete in esports? The third discussion point is, in what manner will esport affect the hegemonic sport model by becoming a strong counterculture? So this is kind of talking about values building and what esport has to offer a traditional sport by setting it up in competition with it and drawing fans and money and spectators away from it. Will it help the traditional sport world kind of get more established and become stronger if they have a competitor like esports to fight with? The second option is that esports could become an accepted part of the hegemonic sport world or traditional sport culture, in other words, the Olympics. And there are three discussion points that go along with that. The first is, this is straight out of their paper, to be formally acknowledged as a sport by the International Olympic Committee, esport must have an independent and autonomous organization which administers one or several sports at an international level. So we don't have that right now. There are some countries such as China and South Korea, which have ministries that govern esport, but it would need to be more world-covering and international. The second discussion point is related to society's kind of view of esports as far as a bad lifestyle choice for adolescents. And the authors say that, quote, there is no substantial empirical support indicating negative effects on school performance, physical activity, and social life, and instead, quote, all of these benefits that have been seen to occur when people participate in computer gaming, which is improved spatial skills, reaction time, family relationships, parental obedience, social networking, school performance, and abstinence from drinking alcohol and using drugs. In my own field, which is sport and exercise psychology, we've seen similar ideas to what they're talking about, in that researchers tend to lump computer gaming in with TV as a sedentary behavior and then call it physical inactivity, when in reality physical inactivity is actually the absence of physical activity, which occurs because there are barriers preventing people from being physically active, such as living in a bad neighborhood, not having access to sidewalks, school and peer pressure, social status, and parental education levels. These things are much stronger indicators of whether or not somebody will be physically active than what they do in their free time. So taking away TV or computer gaming does not necessarily mean that the person is going to go out and go jogging in that free time they then have available to themselves. More than likely, they'll find another sedentary behavior with which to replace the one that was taken away. The third discussion point is money and time. So basically, it's going to take more money and more time for invested and continually invested, as it progresses for eSport to become accepted by the International Olympic Committee. So we just have to wait and see approach on that. The third option, of course, then is the highly philosophical and hypothetical one of the future of hegemonic sport becoming eSport. And the three discussion points that I picked out to go along with that were ecological considerations, where in the future sports might move to be more eco-minded, like would we rather compete in a digital environment or compete on a racetrack, which requires drivers to use these cars that produce CO2 and then harm the environment by creating the track, and golf courses which require all these chemicals and maintenance and land to keep up, whereas you could just play golf in a digital environment perhaps in the future and be much more eco-minded. And then there's the moral and value judgments of whether or not people will accept putting their kids through sports which may injure them, such as the very, very high injury rates in the NFL in the US, where people typically have careers between 3 and 5 years and come out with severe brain concussion and things like that, and soccer, which is a highly dangerous sport as far as severe trauma injuries, dislocating joints, tearing ACLs, and breaking bones, things like that. So we as a society may come to value esports more because of the competition they provide, but in a very safe venue. And then there's the unforeseen consequences. This is from Alan Gutman's characteristics of sport, and he classified modern sport as fulfilling the 6 characterizations that I listed earlier. But there could be a 7th or 8th one that we don't know about yet, that eSport fulfills that modern sport yet does not. And so, depending on what happens in the future, these kind of characteristics that society develops might be uncovered and valued more than what traditional sport offers. That's everything I wanted to talk about today, and they end the paper near the end with a quote by Jay Coakley when he says, "People will create the future of sport. Fate, computer forecasts, supernatural forces, and the predictions of sociologists will not determine the future." Thanks for listening. Check out my website, mindgamesconsulting.wordpress.com, and hope to see you in episode 2. Bye for now.